There's a secret Hollywood has spent decades hiding in plain sight. While studios built entire careers on camera tricks, hidden platforms, and clever blocking to fake height, a small handful of stars never needed any of it. They simply walked onto a set and towered over every director, co-star, and camera rig built to contain them. Some used that size to terrify audiences into nightmares. Others used it to make grown adults cry in a theater. And one name on this list is so extreme, so far beyond ordinary human proportions, that most people assume it's a typo the first time they hear the number. It isn't. Today we're counting down the 15 most iconic, most talked about giants in film history, the men whose height didn't just support their performances, it became the performance. Stay until the end, because the actor at the very top of this list will completely change how you think about the word tall. Let's begin with the man who redefines it entirely. Forget 6'4". Forget 6'6". Matthew McGrory stood at a reported 7 feet, 6 inches, a number so extreme that most people assume it's a misprint the first time they hear it. It isn't. McGrory wasn't simply the tallest man to appear in this countdown. He was one of the tallest actors to ever hold a genuine speaking role in mainstream American film. You might expect a frame that size to be used purely for shock value, and early in his career, it largely was. Horror audiences remember him from House of 1,000 Corpses and The Devil's Rejects, where his sheer physical scale made scenes feel dangerous before a single line of dialogue was even spoken. He also turned up in the offbeat comedy Bubble Boy, proving there was more range in him than horror alone could capture. But it's Big Fish where McGrory became genuinely unforgettable, and for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Playing a literal giant in Tim Burton's Fable, he brought a surprising softness to the role. Tender, lonely, and quietly human despite towering over every single frame he occupied. It would have been easy for lesser directors to reduce him to a novelty. The best ones refused to. McGrory didn't earn the top spot on this list purely because of his measurements. He earned it because he took an almost unbelievable physical trait and turned it into something genuinely moving on screen. But size alone doesn't build a legend. Sometimes what's hidden underneath the height is what does. And our next entry proves that better than almost anyone in Hollywood history, because for years audiences had no idea whose body was actually inside the costume. Here's a question worth sitting with. How do you become one of the most terrifying screen presences in cinema history without anyone ever seeing your face or hearing your real voice? David Prowse found the answer, and it's stranger than most people realize. Standing at a reported 6'6", Prowse was cast to physically embody Darth Vader across the original Star Wars trilogy, and physically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Every menacing stride, every looming shadow filling a doorway, every ounce of silent, mechanical dread that made Vader feel unstoppable came directly from Prowse's own body language. The now iconic voice belonged to James Earl Jones, but the actual nightmare walking through those Death Star corridors, breathing behind that mask, was Prowse the entire time. It's a strange kind of fame, arguably one of the most instantly recognized silhouettes in the history of film, attached to a face most casual fans wouldn't recognize if he walked past them on the street. Beyond the mask, Prowse built a respectable career of his own, appearing in films like A Clockwork Orange and Frankenstein and The Monster from Hell, both of which leaned heavily into his imposing physical frame. What makes Prowse's story so compelling is what it reveals about screen presence itself. Sometimes a giant doesn't need a single word of dialogue to become immortal. Posture, stride, and shadow were more than enough. But not every towering actor found fame through pure menace. One name on this list took his massive frame and turned it into something achingly tender, and it very nearly earned him an Academy Award. Picture this setup. A man built like a fortress, cast in a role that could have easily reduced him to nothing more than a wall of muscle propping up the story around him. Now imagine that same actor breaking hearts across an entire country and walking away with an Oscar nomination. That's precisely what Michael Clarke Duncan pulled off. Reported at around 6'4", Duncan had the kind of frame Hollywood typically reserves for pure, unfiltered intimidation. And for a while, that seemed to be exactly the lane he was destined for. Then came the Green Mile. As John Coffey, Duncan took his enormous physical size and completely inverted it, using it to convey sorrow, innocence, and a kind of spiritual weight that few actors of any size ever managed to capture convincingly on camera. The contrast was the entire point of the performance. Here was a man who looked like he could tear a steel door off its hinges, playing a character the world tragically misjudged simply because of how large he appeared. That painful gap between outward appearance and inner soul is exactly what earned Duncan his Academy Award nomination, undeniable proof that Hollywood's giants aren't only cast to make audiences flinch. Sometimes they're cast to make audiences weep instead. Duncan's legacy stands as a reminder that size can become a trap for less thoughtful actors, but in the right hands, it transforms into a genuine instrument of empathy. Speaking of instruments of terror that quietly evolved into something more elegant, our next giant spent decades proving that horror doesn't actually need to shout. Sometimes it only needs to stand perfectly still and let its height do the talking. Some actors simply play villains. Christopher Lee made villainy feel almost ceremonial. Reported at around 6'4.5", Lee didn't just happen to be tall. He weaponized that height with a level of discipline very few performers in film history have ever matched. He first became legendary playing Dracula, a role where his sheer physical presence transformed every single entrance into a genuine event. Decades later, entirely new generations discovered him all over again as Saruman in The Lord of the Rings and Count Dooku in Star Wars. 3 wildly different franchises, 3 completely different eras of filmmaking, and in every single one, that same towering silhouette carried an air of ancient, unshakable authority. What separated Lee from countless other tall on-screen villains was restraint above all else. He never needed to raise his voice or move quickly to feel genuinely dangerous. He simply stood like a monument and spoke like a verdict, letting his physical height accomplish work that dialogue alone could never manage. His characters didn't feel like ordinary movie villains. They felt ancient, almost mythological, as though evil itself had decided to take on a permanent physical form. Lee proved, across a career spanning multiple generations of moviegoers, that a true screen giant doesn't fade as time passes. He simply becomes more commanding with age. But before Lee's gothic menace defined an entire era of horror royalty, one American icon was already busy building a completely different kind of legend, measured not in shadows and capes, but in dust, horses, and endless frontier horizons. John Wayne didn't just walk into scenes. He occupied them, the way a general occupies contested territory. Reported at around 6'4", Wayne's height became the literal foundation of an entire genre's visual language, the broad-shouldered, slow-moving, almost mythic embodiment of the American Western hero. Across Stagecoach, The Searchers, Red River, and True Grit, Wayne's size accomplished something remarkably subtle, yet undeniably powerful. It made every doorway on screen look slightly smaller, and every opponent look suddenly, visibly uncertain the second he stepped into frame. But his real skill was never just standing tall for the camera, it was rhythm. He walked, paused, turned, and delivered dialogue as though the entire surrounding landscape had to physically rearrange itself around his presence. Love him or criticize him, and audiences across the decades have done plenty of both. There's simply no denying the scale of the image Hollywood constructed around him over the course of his career. Wayne didn't merely appear in westerns. Hollywood built an entire mythology using his physical frame as the literal blueprint, turning one man's height into the visual definition of an American archetype that still echoes through pop culture today. If Wayne proved a giant could single-handedly build a genre, our next actor proved a giant could just as easily build a nightmare, using nothing but slow, deliberate stillness and a voice velvet enough to make skin crawl. Vincent Price never needed to shout in order to be terrifying. He needed only to loom. Standing at around 6'4", Price carried himself like a haunted aristocrat who already knew every secret hidden inside the room, and that quiet, meticulously controlled menace became his defining signature. Across House of Wax, The Fly, The Pit, and The Pendulum, and Theater of Blood, Price used his height less like a blunt physical weapon and more like a slow-burning psychological threat. He moved deliberately, spoke carefully, and let genuine dread accumulate in the silence between his words. Audiences didn't just fear what Price's characters might eventually do, they feared the agonizing anticipation of it, drawn out across every scene he occupied on screen. That's a remarkably rare gift. Plenty of tall actors lean on raw bulk or overt aggression to generate fear in an audience. Price proved that elegance could be every bit as frightening, arguably more so, than brute force ever could. His height gave him natural theatrical scale, but it was his unmistakable voice, hypnotic, unhurried, almost seductive in delivery, that transformed that scale into genuine, lasting horror. Price showed Hollywood, decades before it was fashionable, that menace could wear velvet instead of muscle. But not every tall leading man's story stayed confined neatly to the screen. One name on this list saw his towering, polished image collide directly with real-world controversy that permanently changed how audiences now see him. Armie Hammer looked for a considerable stretch of his career, like old Hollywood had reached back through time, pulled out the perfect studio-era leading man, and then made him even taller for good measure. Reported at around 6'4.5", Hammer brought a polished, symmetrical, almost aristocratic frame to The Social Network, The Lone Ranger, The Man from UNCLE, and Call Me by Your Name. On screen, that height translated directly into an old-fashioned kind of glamour, the sort of tall, composed, camera-friendly presence that made him a natural fit for roles built around privilege, charm, and emotional distance. For a stretch of years, he was genuinely viewed as exactly the kind of throwback leading man classic studio-era casting directors would have fought over. But Hammer's story also serves as a reminder that a towering screen image doesn't automatically protect a career from collapse. His public reputation shifted dramatically in later years, and that shift has since complicated how audiences now revisit the earlier work that once defined him. Whatever conclusions one draws about his public image today, there's no disputing the sheer physical presence he brought to the screen throughout his rise. Hammer's arc shows that height can build an image quickly, but can't necessarily guarantee that image survives intact. Our next entry knows something about complicated public perception too, though his came from a very different kind of controversy entirely. The on-screen kind built across decades of martial arts, eerie calm, and a persona audiences either embraced completely or rejected outright. Steven Seagal didn't move through action cinema the way a typical hero does. He moved like a solid wall that had somehow learned martial arts along the way. Reported at around 6'4", Seagal built his entire screen persona around one very specific kind of intimidation. Not speed, not flash, but sheer, immovable calm. In Above the Law, Hard to Kill, and Under Siege, Seagal's height formed the backbone of his signature style. The heavy coat, the perfectly still face, the sudden and brutal takedown that always seemed to arrive after one long, eerie beat of patience. He wasn't selling athleticism the way most 1980s action stars did. He was selling inevitability, the unmistakable sense that trouble had already arrived the instant he entered a scene, whether or not the plot had technically caught up yet. Whether audiences today view his screen persona fondly or critically is a genuinely divisive question, and public opinion on Seagal has shifted considerably across the decades since his commercial peak. But there's simply no denying that his physical presence made an entire subgenre of action filmmaking work throughout the 80s and 90s. Seagal's calm before the storm energy is one specific flavor of intimidation. But if you want to see raw, sculpted, almost impossible-looking size used to terrify an entire nation of moviegoers in a single unforgettable scene, you have to look at the man who became boxing's most feared on-screen opponent of the entire 1980s. Dolph Lundgren looked like Hollywood had engineered a genuine human weapon, then, almost as an afterthought, handed it cheekbones and an actual advanced college education. Reported somewhere between 6'4.5" and 6'5", Lundgren exploded onto the world stage as Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, a role built almost entirely around a single idea: physical intimidation, so extreme it barely registered as human. That one performance could have permanently boxed him in as a disposable, one-note action villain. Instead, Lundgren kept evolving film after film. He appeared in Masters of the Universe, Universal Soldier, The Expendables, and Creed II, moving fluidly between menacing villain, established action icon, and eventually a far more reflective, weathered veteran screen presence. What's genuinely remarkable about Lundgren's career isn't just the size that made him internationally famous in the first place, it's the sheer longevity that followed. Plenty of towering action stars quietly fade from relevance the moment their physical peak passes. Lundgren adapted instead, proving decisively that a screen giant's career doesn't have to expire the moment the muscle inevitably does. Lundgren turned Cold War-era intimidation into a decade-spanning career. Our next actor took a completely different route toward action stardom entirely, starting in devastating, prestige-heavy dramatic roles long before an unexpected late-career pivot turned him into one of the genre's most surprising icons. Liam Neeson possesses the rare kind of height that makes kindness look genuinely noble and violence look absolutely terrifying, sometimes within the very same scene. Standing at around 6'4", Neeson spent years quietly building emotionally heavy, prestige-driven performances long before a single film completely reinvented his entire career trajectory. In Schindler's List, Michael Collins and Rob Roy, His height gave his characters a distinct kind of moral gravity, the palpable sense of a man carrying enormous, invisible weight, whether that weight was guilt, responsibility, or grief. Later, Batman Begins and the Gray pushed that same commanding presence in noticeably darker, far more physical directions. Then came Taken, and almost overnight, a respected dramatic actor known primarily for prestige roles transformed into a genuine, late-career action legend, with audiences barely blinking at the transition, because the underlying size and gravity had quietly been there the entire time. Neeson could look protective, haunted, dangerous, or completely broken, sometimes all within a single scene, and remarkably, his height never once felt like a cheap gimmick. It simply became part of his overall authority as a performer. Neeson didn't simply grow tall and get lucky with casting. He built decades of genuine dramatic credibility first, then let his physical frame carry him into an entirely new genre altogether. Our next giant took the exact opposite path, walking straight out of mythology-adjacent fantasy roles and directly into modern comic book stardom, looking like he was quite literally born for both. Some actors look like they were assembled by a Hollywood casting department. Jason Momoa looks like he was assembled by mythology itself. Reported at around 6'4", his height, build, and effortlessly natural physicality made him a perfect fit for warriors, kings, and larger-than-life icons practically from the very beginning of his career. As Khal Drogo in Game of Thrones and later as Aquaman in the DC Universe, Momoa accomplished something a lot of physically massive actors genuinely struggle with. He turned pure size into authentic charisma instead of stiff, wooden intimidation. He moves like someone who's completely comfortable being watched at all times, a skill that's actually far rarer among towering actors than casual audiences might assume. That giant frame could have easily trapped him permanently in one-note big scary warrior roles for the remainder of his career. Instead, his natural warmth fundamentally changed the entire equation, allowing him to feel simultaneously intimidating and genuinely playful, sometimes within the very same breath, sometimes within the very same scene. Momoa proves conclusively that modern Hollywood's giants don't have to choose between menace and charm. But not every towering leading man wears his size quite so comfortably. Our next entry built an entire career playing men whose confident, powerful exteriors were quietly cracking apart underneath the surface the whole time. Ben Affleck's height has always been an inseparable part of his screen identity, even in films that never openly acknowledge it directly. Reported at around 6'4", Affleck carries the broad, modern leading man frame that made Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, The Town, Gone Girl, and Batman v Superman feel physically convincing to audiences on screen. But here's what genuinely makes Affleck interesting as a performer. He rarely coasts on playing simple, uncomplicated power. His most memorable characters are consistently men under crushing pressure, ambitious, wounded, arrogant, or completely cornered by consequences of their own choices. His physical size makes those characters look powerful and firmly in control on the surface. His best performances then quietly reveal the deep insecurity churning just underneath that surface. That contrast is the entire engine driving his best work as an actor. A less thoughtful performer might have simply coasted on the physical presence Hollywood clearly wanted to cast around from the start. Affleck instead built a genuine career out of methodically undermining that presence, letting audiences see the visible cracks in men who supposedly had everything figured out. Affleck isn't merely a tall star. He's a tall star who consistently looks trapped by his own carefully constructed image, and that persistent tension is exactly what makes him compelling to watch. Now let's rewind several decades to a very different kind of leading man, one whose towering frame helped single-handedly define an entire golden age of Hollywood romance.